Well, okay, so we talked last week about introducing the Easter season and how we'd go ahead and start some sermons, obviously, about the season rather than just wait till Easter Day and try to dump everything on the one day about the one sermon. So, there were events leading up to, that built up to the events of the crucifixion and the resurrection. And today I'd like to talk about another part of the story leading up to that, what's called Passion Week, that last week of Jesus' life, the Easter season. And that is, Jesus warned his disciples 3 times, at least that's the way the Bible lays it out, at least 3 times that are recorded, about his impending arrest and his beatings and his death and his resurrection. So I want us to look today at those 3 times where he said that and see what we can learn from his teaching them. It's one of the relatively few things that is mentioned in all 3 of what's called the Synoptic Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke cover all 3 of those instances, those 9 different sections of the Bible there that talk about this. And there's not a lot of things in Jesus' life that they all pick up on, but they did on this. So I think that might mean it's kind of important. And I want us to ask ourselves as we read through this, what were the reactions of those that he was telling about this? And while we're thinking about their reactions, think about, well, if I were there, how would I have reacted possibly to this announcement that Jesus made time and time again? So I'll start in Matthew 16, and that's what Lauren was nice enough to read for us. In the book of Matthew actually has probably has the longest and the most complete version each time. But I'm going to augment from Luke and from Mark as well as we go through here. But here in Matthew 16, and we'll just read verse 21, just the first verse to start, where he announces this. It says, "From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the 3rd day be raised to life." Seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Doesn't seem like there's a lot of ambiguity there. I mean, he just laid out this, then this, then this, then this. It's the order it's going to happen in. This is all that's going to happen to me. I just want you to know. So he's telling those most trusted disciples around him. Where was he when he says it? We're not sure, but if we keep backing up in the narrative a little bit, we find out that he was in, just before that, he was in an area, Caesarea Philippi, and that's an area that's far from Jerusalem. It's kind of often almost a pagan territory, just about out of Israel. And so he tells them the first time, and we don't know how far ahead of his trip to Jerusalem he tells them, but he tells them 3 times, so this was some time before that. And it was in an area distant, away, not close to Jerusalem yet at all. So he's almost like, okay, I'm going to give you kind of a pre-warning. I'm going to kind of tell you early on what's going to happen. So what was the reaction? Well, Peter, we know Peter's personality. We hear about that in a lot of stories. Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay, rebuking the Lord. Doesn't seem like a good idea to me. But he began to rebuke him and said, "Never, Lord," he said, "this will never happen to you." Well, we know later in the story, Peter tried to make sure it didn't happen to him. He pulled the sword out and chopped off somebody's ear. And Jesus told him to cut that out because you're interfering with what is supposed to be happening. So there's a plan there that Peter doesn't understand, doesn't accept, and he actually, and I looked up the word in the Hebrew, he rebukes Jesus and says, you can't do this. It's not right. It's not fair. It's not what I'm expecting. Peter might have been his attitude. It's not what we disciples signed on for when we got into this. It's just a crazy idea. It's kind of what he was saying. And the whole idea of the cross, the whole idea of his master and his Lord heading to the cross would be crucified, which was the most ignominious way that a person could die at that point in time, that somehow Jesus is saying that's where he's going to end up. And Peter just was offended by that. He was bothered by that a lot. It was a stumbling block to him. And the word stumbling block is scandalon in the Greek. He says that in verse 23. Jesus turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." So Peter didn't do well at the way he accepted that. Satan threw him in that sense. Jesus was just trying to point out where that attitude was coming from. Was a scandalous thing, was a scandalon to Jesus. Why did Jesus have to suffer and die? You ever heard anybody ask questions like that? You ever ask those questions to yourself? They're good questions to ask. Why did Jesus have to suffer and die? Was that a scandal? Why all this blood? Why not just change people's hearts and fix things? God could do that. Couldn't he just by fiat just sort of beckon or move a muscle and everything could be absolutely fixed? Well, not really. I mean, he could, but would that really fix things? Would that just take away all our free will and the love that he has for us and we for him? So Peter was fighting against God's plan, in effect. He wouldn't accept what God said, this is the way it is. What would we have done? I don't know. I would have been any better than that. Looking back, it's easy. We got the Bible. We have the whole story. We know the way it turns out. Looking back, I might go, oh, well, I wouldn't have fallen for that. Well, I don't know. I think if I were a Jew in that day and I'd grown up in that religion and I was expecting certain things out of my Messiah and he told me these other things were going to happen, that was going to be a total embarrassment to our little group, I think I might have been, no, we're not going down that road. And that might have been me right there with the rest of them. Satan loves it when we doubt and when we even rebel. We do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. That happens in our own lives many times. And then in verse 24, it says, "Then Jesus said to his disciples, 'Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it.' What good will it be," it says, "if a man gains the whole world yet forfeits his soul? What can anyone give in exchange for their soul?" And so he's pointing out that there's a plan, and God's got it in control. He's going to the cross for a reason, and you and I have crosses too that we have to live with day in and day out. We have to live with things we don't always understand, just as Peter didn't understand at that point what was happening. He didn't have God's view. He couldn't see forward far enough that he could look back and see that it all worked out. And I think sometimes in your life and my life, we know what God's saying, but we don't see the picture like we could and maybe should. And so we begin to question and doubt. And that gets us sometimes into trouble. So he tells us sometimes we just have to trust him. We have to count on his promises. And we have to just carry our cross until we see the solution that God has for us. And I won't go into the other two versions there because Matthew pretty well covers that first time. But in Matthew 17, this is the second time that Jesus speaks to his disciples about his upcoming death. And we see it in Matthew 17, and this is what it says in verse 22 and 23. It says, "When they came together in Galilee," now he's in Galilee. He's not in Caesarea Philippi, which is way up in the north. He's now in Galilee, which is where he's from. And it's closer to Jerusalem than the first time. When they came together in Galilee, he said to them, and here he goes again. See if there's any ambiguity in this. "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life." Seems pretty clear again, doesn't it? But not something that they were willing to accept. Because it says, "Now the disciples were filled with grief," it says. And that's in the NIV version. In the King James Version, it says they were exceedingly sorry. So there was some kind of a sorrow there. There was a grief. It makes me think that they were beginning to realize the facts of what he was saying. That he really means that he's going to be taken into custody and tried and beaten and crucified. He really means this. And they were sad. They were sorrowful about that when they heard it. And that was their reaction at that point. So maybe they learned a little more. Maybe they were beginning to hear a little more clearly what he was saying and what he was telling them. If we go back to Mark 9, which is the parallel version, Mark 9:32, it adds a little more to the story. It says, they, the disciples, Mark 9:32, they did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. That's interesting, isn't it? They didn't understand what he meant. They understood the words a little better, possibly. They got the language. They said, okay, the facts are, this is really what he's saying, but I don't understand what he means by this. Why would he do this? Why would he let himself be killed? A lot of why questions started popping up at this point in their mind. Why would he allow something like that to happen? What is the purpose? What's the benefit of going and getting yourself killed? Why not save the world another way? Something that's more honorable, something that makes us all look better than this going to the cross kind of concept. Let's see, I think there's another phrase at the end of that verse. Let's see, Mark 9:32. It says, they were afraid to ask him about it. I always wondered about that. Is that because Jesus is just so mean? Is that because if they said something, he'd scream and yell at them or throw pots or pans or something? No, there had to be something else there. They were afraid to ask him about it. Maybe they weren't afraid because of his reaction, although there were a few times Jesus had reactions like, get behind me, Satan. Maybe they didn't want that again. I'm sure Peter learned a lesson there. But maybe they really didn't want to know. Maybe they didn't want this to be true, and they thought, well, if we don't clarify it, maybe it won't happen. So they were afraid to ask him about it, possibly for a reason like that. In Luke 9, in verse 45, that's the other place that it mentions the second telling. It says that they did not understand. It uses that phrase. And it says it was hidden from them that they did not grasp it. It was hidden from them that they did not, another version says, perceive it. So they heard it. They kind of understood it, but they didn't grasp it. They didn't know what that meant. They didn't know why he would go that far. And so they're beginning to accept that he would, but they didn't understand why. What if I had been there? I just have to think about today in my life. Any of you ever been in a position, any of you ever struggled to comprehend something that God has told us? Something you've read in the Bible? Something you feel, maybe you've heard from a friend, maybe you've heard in a sermon, something that you know is really true, that's really from God. But it seems hidden in a sense, that you really can't grasp it and perceive it. Maybe because we don't want to sometimes. Maybe because other times it's just so foreign to us that it takes a while for our mind to circle back around and to be changed to say, well, okay, that's what that means. So here it was the second time he told them. I don't know how much time was between these two, but they still didn't grasp it. They still didn't perceive it. There's so many things about God's nature, about his teachings, about his plan that we read about, we hear about, and some of those things are so foreign to us in our human nature that we really have to sometimes give it time, give it some prayer, give it just experience to let that soak in, to understand where it's coming from. We all want to know the why. We want to know the why questions. Those are the most prevalent questions, especially when something's tough, when we're going through a trial, when our sickness is there, or the money's not there, whatever it might be. We want to know why. Why, God, would you allow this? Why would you allow that person to die? Why would you allow this to happen to children? Why are there all this suffering in the world? And we wonder why. And those things are not always clear, and sometimes they don't ever become totally clear. I've mentioned before in sermons that rather than know the answers to the why questions, if we can know the answer to the who question, then we know the most important answer. Who is it that's telling us that? Who is it that's promising that? Who is it that's in charge of that? Who is it that has their hand on the wheel, as our reading from Andre told us? Who have we removed our hands from the wheel and let him take the wheel from us? That's the question. So if I were standing there, I think I would have the same questions. The third time that he tells them the same thing is in Matthew 20, verses 17 through 18. It says this. It says, "Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem." See, now he's gone from Caesarea Philippi at some point in the past to Galilee, where he talked the second time. And now the third time, he's on the way to Jerusalem. He's heading for that final trip into the city. I don't know that he's literally on the road at that point, but mentally, another place in the Bible it says, what's the term it uses? He was going up to Jerusalem. He set his face toward Jerusalem. There's phrases like that that are used. And that's the point where Jesus has made the commitment. He knows what's coming. He knows there's no way around it, and he's committed to do it. And he sets his face. He turns his way toward Jerusalem and toward everything that last visit in Jerusalem would bring to him. He is committed. There's no turning back. He's in that final lap. And it says here in verse 17, "Now Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, and on the way he took the 12 aside and he said to them." So we might stop there a second. Now, maybe he did that previously. It doesn't say exactly. He had a larger group of followers that followed with him, and different ones came and went. He had the core 12, but it says specifically at this point that he took those 12 aside and told them this thing specifically. Maybe that's because he just wanted to make an impression, be like getting them by the shoulders, kind of like when you talk to somebody and say, "Are you hearing what I'm saying?" In a sense, when he pulled those 12 and he said, "Let's go over here. Let's take this special time. Let me tell you again something that's very, very important to all of us, and I need you to understand this. And you may not understand it right now, but I need you to understand this when the time is right." So he takes the 12 aside and he says to them, "We are going up to Jerusalem," we, the group, "and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death, and they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified. And on the third day, he will be raised to life." Were they beginning to get it a little bit? He told the people, his followers, I think, they needed to not only be aware, they needed to be prepared. Mentally, emotionally, every way they could. They need to be prepared for this. And he was doing his best to prepare them for it. They needed to be faithful, too. We see that didn't work out so good initially, did it? When they all scattered in the Garden of Gethsemane. And I think he's telling them here, too, they need to be hopeful because of the end result. But there wasn't a lot of hope in their response later on, was there? We'll read about that in a minute. So he tells them kind of two parts, I think. He tells them, "I will die," which includes the suffering, the beating, the trial, the whole bit. That part, was it beginning to sink in? The fact that he wasn't going to live through this. Maybe they were beginning to grasp that a little. And then part two that he tells them, "I will be raised to life." I don't think they had a clue about that one. That doesn't happen. People got crucified all the time. They knew that could happen. They saw the injustice. They saw what went on. They saw probably innocent people being put up on those stakes from time to time. But to say, "I'll be raised alive," now that's something that doesn't happen. What did he mean by that? How are we supposed to have some hope out of that? Because that just never happens. I can't understand that. I don't believe that. I'm not hoping. That doesn't give me hope. That confuses me, is what they might have been thinking. In Mark 10 is the other place. It's the third way it's mentioned. Mark 10, verse 32 covers a little bit before the statement in Mark. It says, as they went toward Jerusalem, the disciples were astonished, or amazed, it says in another version, were astonished, while those that followed were afraid. So you had this larger group that was following Jesus around, and some, the disciples, and it could mean the 12 in general, they were astonished. While others that were following in the group, followers of Jesus, were afraid. So a lot of mixed feelings, a lot of still confusion at this point. What's going on? Some of the group probably thought one thing and some thought another. And they talked about it as they camped at night or stayed in people's homes and however. This was a point of discussion. What does he mean? What do you think he means? Well, this is what I think he means. And when it's all said and done, they still don't know what he means. And so they're confused and they're afraid because they're about to lose their leader, possibly. The one that they put so much stock in, and he was going to be taken from them and killed. Luke 18, verse 34, tells us a little bit after what Jesus, the statement that he made about his death and his resurrection. And it says, it adds this on the tail end. It says, the disciples did not understand any of this. Its meaning was hidden from them, and they did not know what he was talking about. Well, he said it plainly. What do you mean he didn't know what he was talking about? It didn't register. It couldn't have. They just couldn't get the depth of what he was saying. And so although they were hearing the words and they're respecting him as their leader, they were confused, they were afraid, it wasn't clear, the meaning was hidden, and they didn't know what he was talking about. So that's the way they entered Jerusalem. It's more confusing, and we'll probably preach about this later, but he enters Jerusalem with a lot of people yelling, Hosanna, King of the Jews, and the palm branches, and he's on the donkey, and they're laying their coats in front of him, and all that looks so wonderful and fine, and the disciples are probably thinking when that's happening, what was he saying about all this death and dying stuff previously? Look, everything's better now. We're coming into town. Everybody knows who we are. They know who Jesus is. Hosanna to the King of the Jews. It's all good. We'll just forget about what he said before. Can't have any meaning. And then other things happen, don't they? There is a trial, arrest. There are beatings and scourgings and mockings. There is a crucifixion. Just what he said. Exactly what he said. So what are the reactions after all that happened? The women at the tomb, it says in Mark 16, the women at the tomb were bewildered. They were there, but they were bewildered. It says the disciples in Mark 16:11, it says when the women came back and told them that they had seen Jesus at the tomb and he was alive, it says the disciples did not believe it. Thomas, you remember, doubting Thomas, poor Thomas. Can't even say Thomas without saying doubting Thomas, right? Doubting Thomas said, unless I see the nail scars in his hands and put my hand into his side, I won't believe it. Later, they did come to believe it. But initially, do you think they remembered what he said? Well, yeah, they did. Finally, it says they remembered back on what Jesus said and realized that this was a fulfillment. But at the time, if I would have been there, if you would have been there, would we have caught on to that? Would we have understood what Jesus was saying? He spoke clearly. He told them exactly what they needed to know, exactly where to put their trust. I told you so. I bet he said that later. That's not recorded in Scripture, but I bet when you saw him later, he said, I told you so. Didn't I? You didn't pay attention? Didn't you hear what I said? Don't we love to say that? I told you so. Maybe Jesus didn't say it. He's God. Maybe he didn't rub it in. But I don't know. So what about today? We can look back at their views. We can kind of try to put ourselves in their place. But what about you and me today? Let's see if we can pull this forward for a lesson for today. I think God gives us many clear directions and guidance. Generally, that's via the Bible, via the leading of the Holy Spirit, and our understanding of that. What is our reaction today? Now, he's not telling us the exact facts that he's telling them at that point, because that's past and that's happened. We know that. We understand and believe that. But what about other things in your life and my life, where we're asking God why or what or how, and he puts in front of us, here it is. Read it. Listen to it. Hear this. And we go, I don't like that. I'm going to rebel. I think I'm going to rebuke Jesus on that one. No, I don't want to do that. That doesn't sound, that's not comfortable. That's not what I want to do right here. That's going to take some guts. I'm going to lose a friend over that. I'm going to have to change my lifestyle. I'm going to have to give something up. I don't think I like that. Might we say that sometimes? Do we always understand what he's telling us? Do we have perfect trust? Do we even want to accept what he's telling us sometimes, especially when it's hard stuff? Or do we want to go, no, that's too hard. I think I'll do it this other way. Didn't work too good for Adam and Eve. Hasn't worked for anybody since then. You know, he tells us some things pretty straightforward. These are some of the I told you so's, I think, in the Bible. There's many, many of them. He talks to us about gossip in the Bible. He says, don't gossip. That means you've got an evil tongue, that you're spreading things about people that are hurtful. Well, we know not to do that. It's pretty clear. Do we do it? Yeah, well, it's hard not to sometimes. It's just so tempting. We do stuff like that. But he's telling us these things just like he told them exactly what was going to happen to him. He's telling us exactly, in many cases, very, very clear. He tells us to forgive others. He's got parables. He's got teachings. He's got the whole Beatitudes. He's got so many times he tells us to forgive other people, even if they don't deserve it, even if they don't forgive us. That's hard. I don't know. I don't know if I can do that. That's hard. Maybe I don't understand what he's telling me, like the disciples didn't understand, thought they didn't understand. It says in the Bible that God made them male and female. That's in question today, isn't it? Are we male or are we female? Can we be either, both? Do we have a choice? It seems to indicate that no, he made them male and female. That seems pretty clear. We should go with that. Marriage is between one man and one woman. There's other alternatives today. That's the society we live in. Doesn't mean the people are bad and evil and we should shun, but it's not God's way. That's not the way he designed things. Marriage is between a man and a woman. Stealing is a sin. We know that. Lust is a sin. These things are told us plainly, even examples given about how to avoid those kind of things. And we try, but sometimes do we hear clearly? Do we accept it? Do we want to know the whys? Well, God, if you'll just explain to me why, then I'll do it. And then sometimes he says, I'm just telling you the way it is. You just need to do it. You just need to trust me. Murder is murder. Murder is a sin. Doesn't matter what age the person is, if they're preborn or born or elderly, murder's still a sin. Our nature is to fight against his word, as the disciples fought against it and acted confused and possibly were confused about it. They doubted, they rebelled. Paul calls it kicking against the pricks, is the King James Version later. In an instance in his life, they even tried to rebuke God about what he was teaching them. But he's God, and the lack of trust and obedience brings bad consequences when we do that. Other I told you so's of God are like this. God will not give us more than we can bear. He says that, doesn't he? You ever felt in your life like that wasn't true? Like, I can't bear this. Well, but he says, I won't give you more than you can bear. He says he never leaves us or forsakes us. That's pretty clear. Never leave you or forsake you. Do we doubt that? Sometimes. Doesn't feel that way. But he says it. It's an I told you so. If the Father cares for the grass and the birds, how much more does he care for each of us? It's there. Do we believe it? He's preparing a place for us, he says, so that we can be with him forever. But sometimes do we doubt that? We're not qualified. We're not measuring up. We're not good enough. Somehow we've done something that's taken us out of the running for that. He's preparing a place, he says. And no one, he says in another place, not even Satan, can snatch us out of his hand. That's true. He says. That's what he tells us. Do we believe that? God's love and mercy for you and me is never ending. These are things he says. These are things he means. Do we accept and believe these things? The disciples had trouble hearing some pretty clear words and understanding. And maybe we do too sometimes in our Christian walk. Maybe we have trouble understanding but just believing and just taking at face value what God has told us. But that's what he means. He says what he means, and he means what he says. Jesus spoke clearly to his disciples about his upcoming death and his resurrection. And they didn't get it until much later, looking back. Let's learn the lessons from their experience. God speaks to you and to me today, directing us to hear his words of instruction and correction and promise. He says, I told you so. I'm telling you, this is the way it is. So let's not be deaf. Let's not be doubting. Let's not be disobedient. But rather let us trust in his words to us and live every day thankful for his ultimate Easter season sacrifice on the cross that cleanses us and redeems us and makes us his own.